Dobrý podvečer, velice vás vítáme tady v Městské knihovně. Taky děkuji Městské knihovně za to, že tady můžeme být dnes, v tomto hezkém prostředí. Já mluvím teď česky, ale za chvilinku přejdeme na angličtinu. Doufám, že všichni rozumí anglicky. Můžu už přepnout do angličtiny. Oh, did the windows close itself? Interesting. A very warm welcome this evening to an evening with one of Lithuania's foremost literary figures. Sitting next to me, Tomas Venclova. He is a poet. He's also an academic, closely associated over many years with two of the most famous universities in the world, Berkeley and more recently Yale. Please correct me if there's anything I said that's wrong. Not only is he a poet and an academic, the celebration of this evening, not only is he a poet and an academic, but also a translator. Tomas has translated the work of many writers, poets, some dramatists, in particular in connection with I suppose what we would call the modern. We could include many names: Boris Pasternak, Anna Akhmatova, Charles Baudelaire, Alfred Jarry, T.S. Eliot, John Osborne, Konstantin Cavafy, Dylan Thomas, Czesław Miłosz, Joseph Brodsky. There are many more names we could add to that list, and he's translated them into Lithuanian. But to start with, so that we can hear some poetry as soon as possible, we're going to start with a poem that has a connection with Tomas's roots in the city of Klaipėda in Lithuania. So maybe you'd said you'd like at first to say a few words about this particular poem, which also I think would be an opportunity to talk a little bit about the city of Lithuania.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me well? Not very well. Well, I will do my best. Unfortunately, I don't speak Czech, although I understand some of it, because I speak Polish. And my Polish is as good as my Lithuanian, but my Czech is much worse than my Lithuanian. Now, the poem I am we will read 6 to 7 poems, some of them longer, some of them shorter. The first one is rather long. It has a title, Prehistory. It's about my early childhood. I was born in 1937 in the city of Klaipėda. In German, it has the name Memel. That's a city with an interesting fate. The so-called Memelgebiet reminds one rather closely of the Sudetenland. It was inhabited to a large degree by German speakers, and it was taken by Hitler in 1939. At that time I was only 2 years old. My father and mother, my father was a leftist writer, a Marxist. I mentioned him in the poem, speak about him, how he brings his young wife to just the maternity ward, and she gives birth to a small child. And speak about the city of Klaipėda. So it was taken by Hitler, who made a speech from the balcony of the city theater that is mentioned in the poem. And also I mention a name Marinesco. Probably not everybody knows who Marinesco was. He was a captain of a Soviet submarine who destroyed a German steamship, Wilhelm Gustloff. That's a topic of a novel by Günter Grass, by the way. That was in 1945, and more people perished in that catastrophe than in the catastrophe of Titanic. But not everybody knows about that story. So there is a monument to Marinesco in Kaliningrad or Königsberg. Well, Marinesco, perhaps he was not as guilty as one can suppose, because he most likely thought that he was destroying a military ship. But he destroyed civil people, several thousand of civil people, many of them inhabitants of Klaipėda, of Memel. So, and now I will read it in Lithuanian, just for giving you the feeling of the language, which is strange. Maybe we can talk more about Lithuanian later. But now the text. Atpažink nesvetingas vietas, kur augai kadaise, kitoje šalyje, kito amžiaus centre, bevaisė kopų juosta karklynai, sandėlio mūras ant kranto, vargu ar primins, kieno čia tuomet gyventa. Gatvėm zujo vienišius taksi ir trys karietaitės, oranžadas lašėjo ant parko takų, vokietaitės alėjoj anapus bėgių, būriavos nuo pusės 4, pasilenkdamos prie vežimėlio, tardavo: Ziusas kind, ilgėjos imperijos herbų, mini geltoną smėlį, plojo šešėliui senamiestį ant balkono, kad paskui šukuosenas, skrybėles, žiedus į prėską marių skystį gramzdintų laimėtojas Marinesco. Tai ne visas kraštovaizdis, žymiai svarbiau padangės, joms į veidą žvelgiančios žvarbios vidurdienio bangos, kaminai gan brališčių stirtos, neįpač dosniai išbarstyti kanalo kraštuos, apyžemiai gluosniai, dvokia plekšnis vėjas linguoja, palaikę jachtą prie tilčiuko. Matau, pedagogas gniauždamas raktą iš Raudonojo kryžiaus pargrįžta namo, kad nusnūstų ir be didelio džiaugsmo įvertina laikiną būstą. Skalbiniai vidinas mansardoj bilda langinės, krupatinkas ant lopšio, nuo Markso dumba lentynos, o uždanės kvartalas į fachverko raigulį skaidos, monotoniškai tarsi atsikartojantis aidas. Pasagų skambesys indaujoj atsiliepia šaukštą ir fajansas, akis ties uostą aptinka neaukštą anglikonų bažnyčią, stogelis tarytum puodynės dangtis, toliau beveik nieko, Europos riba arba slengstis. Šilykšti pamadai šie pelkynai, kuriuos po lygiai savo kaulais paplėšė prūsai, venedai, lyviai. Praeities katalogas, Nachosten, Westen, bėgimas, nuskandinti laivai, nenuvaldomas jūrų slėgimas, virš plito konteinerių nepasipriešinsi sroviai, aidas pliūpsniais plakas, nykioj žolėtoj tvirtoviai. Taip skaistus atspindys mirkuliuoja rytmečio šaltį, po sustingusią valtim ryškesnės už pačią valtį. Taip gilus, bet vos atpažintas balsas per sapną, atkartojęs bereikšmį garsą daugiau pasako, nei dienos pašnekovai. Pasaulio, kurio nebelieka, rūpinas nimfa, niekad nemieganti echo. Virš pranykusio gimtojo miesto, nuo pats Kagerako, ligi Botnijos šcherų, nuo rūkstančio grobšto rago, lig boluojančio kopgalio, tarsi teismo primėtas, plaukia aiškus, toliau už mus ridenamas ritmas. Jis pažadins tamsoj, palydės namo iš nelaisvės, kad dėkotum už viską, net ir tada, kai laikas, it pritylęs cenzorius, tavo figūrą ir gestą gramšte nugramš nuo lapo nuotraukos teksto.
We are now going to hear the same poem in a Czech translation. It's actually breaking one of the golden rules of translation. It's a translation through a translation into German, but it was approved by Tomas Venclova. So it is a translation by Magdalena Škulcová, read by Kajetán Písařovic.
Předtím. Tak poznávám místa, na nichž si vyrůstal. Úplně jinou zemi a jiné století. Pás pustých písečných dun, vrbové křoví a bouda na pláži si sotva už vzpomenou, kdo tenkrát mýval tu svou vlast. Ulicemi bloudil osamělý taxík, 3 kočáry, v parku ukapávala vždycky oranžáda a německé slečinky věděly, že je dobré setkávat se u kasáren od 3:30. Skláněli se nad kočárky, říkali, to je ale krásné děťátko. A brodili se pískem v touze po říši a tleskali jemu, tajemnému z balkónů starého města, než potom jejich klobouky, účesy i prsteny pohltilo moře, vítěz Marinesko. Ten obraz ovšem není celý, neboť důležité je nebe, když se svítivě mihotají drsné polední vlny a komíny, spousta čapích hnízd, mláďata na břehu kanálu, u daleko od sebe stojících vrb. A páchnou tu platýzy. Vítr pohybuje jachtou schátrale ležící úmla. Vidím učitele, ruce sevřené v pěst, přichází od Červeného kříže, snaží se lehce kývnout na pozdrav. Bez zájmu se rozhlíží po příbytku, jež mu přidělili. Mansarda je plná prádla, okenice vržou, odlupuje se omítka, padá na kolébku. Na policích spousta Marxe. Za řekou Dange se městská čtvrť vlévá do pestrobarevných skvrn hrázděných domů. Monotónně jako ozvěna, jež se opakuje už celé dny. Zvuky podkov. Lžíce i kamenina shodně odpovídají v příborníku. Na protější straně přístavu se okolo zahledí na malý anglikánský kostel. Střecha jako víko na kotli. A jinak tu není skoro nic. Hranice Evropy. Praha. Toto ploché, do dálky se táhnoucí pobřeží, močálovitá krajina, již Prusové stejně jako Livonci a Venétové hnojili svými kostmi. Soupisy z dějin na východ, na západ. Útěk a potopené lodě. Tíha moře. Nad kontejnery s iperitem. Tomuhle proudění nemůžeš vzdorovat. Avšak v pochmurném bunkru tam nahoře se chvěje ozvěna. Odlesk se třpytí v ranním chladu. pod trouchnivějící loďkou o tolik průzračnější než ona loďka dnes. V hloubi ve snu téměř cizí hlas opakuje bezvýznamnou hlásku a říká víc, než hlasatelé vždycky za dne. O svět, z něhož už nic nezbylo, o svět pečuje nymfa. Ozvěna nikdy nespí. Rodné město se vytrácí od Skageraku až k ostrůvkům v Botnickém zálivu. Od dýmu na Krušské kose až k zářící pevnosti Neringa přináší moře zvláštní rytmus. Zní jako pozoun a po našem příchodu se valí dál. Ve tmě tě probudí a přivede tě domů. Z poroby. Abys také za všechno poděkoval, až čas, ten prohnaný cenzor, seškrábe tvou postavu, tvá gesta, dokonce i z archu papíru a z fotografie, i ze samotného textu.
Just quickly, because there are one or two people in the audience who speak only English and don't speak either Lithuanian or Czech, I did a quick working translation of the first few lines of that poem. So I shall start by reading it. So recognize the places on which you grew up, a quite different land and another century. The strip of barren dunes, the willow bushes, and the shed on the beach will scarcely remember who once had his home here. Through the streets drifted a lonely taxi, 3 coaches. Orangeade was always dripping in the park, and the German Fräulein knew to gather by barracks from 3:30 onwards, and said, leaning over prams, "Süßes Kind," and tramped longing for the empire through the sand with applause in the town at the mystery of the balcony, and then afterwards their hats, coiffure and rings were sunk in the sea by Marinesco the victor. Because I'd like to ask you about, in connection with that poem we've just heard, about Klaipėda, do you have memories of the city? You were born in 1937, so any memories you have must be as a very small child.
No, of course I don't have memories of my childhood, early childhood, because we left Klaipėda when Hitler took it, and we left for Kaunas, for the still independent Lithuania. I was 2 years old. But later I visited Klaipėda frequently enough. And I love the city. The city is very unusual, very interesting. It preserves some reminders of its pre-war past. The architecture is mainly neo-Gothic. I would even say that it reminds a bit of Prague, although it is much, much smaller. It reminds also Danzig or Gdańsk, the city of Günter Grass, and its fate was also very similar to Gdańsk's fate. But I never miss an opportunity to visit Klaipėda. I hope to be there in a month or so. I wrote not this particular poem, but also several other poems dedicated to the city of Klaipėda.
And I have the feeling that the Klaipėda in some ways embodies the paradox of Lithuania, doesn't it? That it's a country with a language that's not spoken by many people, but at the same time it's been a crossroads of history, that it has this extraordinarily international and cosmopolitan history.
Yes, and Lithuania consists of 3 parts. The part around Vilnius, the capital, in the interwar period, it was annexed by Poland, and it was mainly Polish-speaking. Also Yiddish-speaking, because approximately half of the population was Jewish. Lithuanian speakers made only 2% of the city's population. Now there are 60 or 70% of Lithuanian speakers, but that's a new phenomenon. And Vilnius is a Baroque city, also comparable to Prague, not to Gothic Prague, but to Baroque Prague. Mainly 17th and 18th centuries. Very beautiful, one of the more beautiful cities in Europe. Smaller than Prague, of course. It is probably 1/3 of Prague, or even 1/4 of Prague. But it's a capital city with a very interesting cultural life and with a very specific face, so to speak, very specific style. Then there is Kaunas, who was a capital of independent Lithuania in the interwar period. It reminds one of, let us say, to what can it be compared? It is Art Nouveau. Not Art Nouveau, it is Art Deco. They say that there are only 3 classical Art Deco cities in the world: Miami Beach, Tel Aviv, and Kaunas. I have been in all 3 cities, and they are definitely very similar. Kaunas was built mainly in the 30s. In the 30s, when it was a capital city with embassies, with the university, with the theaters, opera and drama, and so on and so on. It still has the theaters, but not the embassies. The embassies now are in Vilnius. But, and lots of that typical international Art Deco style of the 30s, Corbusier and so on and so on. So it has almost nothing in common with Baroque Vilnius or Neo-Gothic Klaipėda. And Klaipėda is a formerly German city with a typical architecture, and also with some memories of that period, and typical because it is a city on the seashore, the only Lithuanian harbor. We have a harbor on the Baltic Sea, and it's typical harbor city, typical port city, so to speak. It's not very big, it's only around 200,000 of population. Vilnius has 600,000 and Kaunas has 400,000. So, but every city has its own face, which cannot be compared to 2 other cities. Everyone is very specific.
And of course there's also a connection to the Prague audience doesn't even need to be reminded. There's a connection to Prague as well. They've been looking down on us is the Vladislav Hall in the Prague Castle, which of course was built by Vladislav Jagiellonski, who was also of Lithuanian origin.
Well, you know, we have lots of connections. Lithuanian history has lots of connections with Czech history, especially during the Hussite period. By the way, my family name is Venclova. In Czech it sounds female, but in Lithuania it is male, and it sounds a bit Czech. So we have a legend in our family that we are descendants of those Czech Hussites who got political asylum in Lithuania in the early 15th century. The Lithuanian Grand Duke Vytautas or Witold, who was a cousin of King Jagiello. So Vytautas was even elected a king of Czech lands, and he never came to Prague, but he sent his representative, who was here a ruler for 7 years. For 7 years. And in Hradzany, we have the Vladislav Hall, which was built by, I think, by Benedict Wright.
The architect, yes.
By architect, who also built a Gothic church in Vilnius, the Church of St. Anne, which is considered to be the best building in Vilnius, the same architect. He also built a cathedral in Kutna Hora. Then, well, to continue, our father of our independence, who was a sort of Lithuanian Tomas Masaryk, whose name was Basanavičius. He spent part of his life in Prague, and he learned from Czechs how to organize the national movement. Then my name is Tomas, and I am proud that my name was taken from Tomas Masaryk, who died several days before my birth. And my father and mother decided to call me Tomas in his honor. And so on and so on. So we have lots of such connections.
Let's hear another poem. The second poem we're going to hear is called in Czech, Básně o ztraceném, a poem about a lost one, the lost one. And we're going to hear it first in Lithuanian and then in translation by Alena Vlčková and Jaroslav Kabíček,
Yes.
which is in this collection,
Yes.
Čas rozpůlil se, which I suppose time fell apart or cut itself in half. Sadly, both the translators are no longer with us. This book was originally going to come out over 30 years ago, but thank goodness it has come out now.
I knew Alena Vlčková. Now, unfortunately, she is deceased, and she knew Lithuanian. She was a beautiful and very gifted lady who knew Lithuanian and translated lots of Lithuanian literature into Czech. So the poem itself is about a soldier of Second World War. It's surrealist. It has lots of strange surrealist images, not always intelligible. And during the Second World War, Lithuanians fought on both sides. There were Lithuanians in the Soviet army, there were Lithuanians in German army, and also in the army of the United States. Lithuanian emigres in Europe came to Europe as part of the United States army. So, and lots of them perished, and that was absurd enough. So the poem is short but strange. Po anglim, po sniegu ir leidžiama netgi dairytis, tarsi vabzdžio sparnai, po anglim, po sniegu, po žeme, aptvėrimų svarstyklės ir juodos atodrėkio plytos ir įmirkusių rąstų būry keturkampė žiema. Taip sudygę laiškai savo tolstantį lauką pasiekia, jų balti adresai pusnyse suartėja grūdai, aš pasieksiu save, aš pasėtas, man laikas ilsėtis, po kanalais ir varpinim burna pripildo kreida, susviruoja platybė, apglėbusi 10 pirštų, savo galvas ir augalas ją pasitinka laiku, po ribotų dangum ir tiršta įšalusių karčių kanopų laivų, taip išmokstam surasti bityną ir parako medų, paliesti veidą ir metų nenutylėt ir atverti kirviu pajuodavusi Naugardo ledą, po kurio atsimerkia ir auga žuvis ir žolė.
Báseň o ztraceném. Pod uhlím, pod sněhem můžeš se rozhlížet bez ustání, jak hmyzí křidélka. Pod zemí, pod sněhem, pod uhlím, vahadla plotů a hrazení, černavé cihlitání a v metrech z vlhlého dřeva čtverhrané krystaly zim. Tak vzklíčené rostliny svých vzdálených brázd dosahují, svých bělostných adres v sklenicích zblížená semena. Sám sebe dosáhnu, vysetý v odpočinkové sluji, pod stokou a zvonicemi ústa zapečetěna. Tak se kymácí prázdnota, svíraná 10 prsty své hlavy, rostlinou vítaná o zlomek chvíle dřív. Pod nebem, odsud až potud, kdy pramen vzbouzí se čistý a všude je mrazně husto plachet a kopyt a hřív. Tak se učíme nacházet včelíny s popraškem medu. Tváří se dotýkat, trubkou jitřit setrvalý stav a ostřím rozvírat zarputilou mlčenlivost ledu, pod nímž se šíří oči a rostou trsy ryb a trav.
Thank you. Now, well, that should be explained that there is some wordplay in the poem. There are several such examples of wordplay, but one should be explained that laiškai, laiškas in Lithuanian means letter, letter in a sense, letter which is sent by mail, and also means shoot of grass, the same word. Okay. Do you have any questions?
I was interested. There's in the language there where you talk about things like the clutching emptiness with 10 fingers, or the ice opening up. How does it go? This opening up the stubborn silence of ice. These deep paradoxes in the language there. What do you actually? I mean, it's a stupid question to ask a poet, but. What are you doing here? What are you trying to capture in this capturing of emptiness, of trying to bring life to what is essentially not there or is frozen?
Well, it's difficult to explain, of course. First of all, this. Let me see. This. Space which clutches by 10 fingers its head. So it's an image of a Russian, how to say it, равнина. Как будет по-английски равнина?
Plain land.
Yes, what?
Plain land.
Plain.
As in rovina in Czech. Yeah.
Plain or steppe maybe. Well, what was the impulse for writing that poem? It's very, very old. It was written probably 60 years ago, believe it or not. And in Novgorod, in the city of Novgorod, in a Russian city. In a Novgorod museum, I found a belt, a soldier's belt, with a Lithuanian letters on it. That was a belt of a Lithuanian who fought on the German side, by the way, and perished. So he speak about that ice of Novgorod, and well, Novgorod is on a big lake. And about a perished person who somehow sinks into that emptiness, whose death is totally absurd.
Let's move on. Your upbringing in Lithuania was not entirely typical, was it? Your father was a very important figure himself in Lithuanian life, wasn't he? I mean, you've said you've compared him to Zdeněk Nejedlý, who is probably one of the least popular cultural figures in Czech history.
Yes, well, he can be compared not only to Zdeněk Nejedlý, whom he knew, by the way. They knew each other personally. But he can be compared also to some more positive figures like Vítězslav Nezval, for example. And he was a leftist writer in the interwar Lithuania. And then he became a pro-Soviet cultural figure. For some time he was the head of the Union of Lithuanian Writers. He traveled a lot. He visited Prague in 1948, believe it or not, during the, how to call it, counter-revolution or something like that.
Putsch.
Yeah, Putsch, yes, Putsch. He visited Prague during the Putsch. He wrote several poems about Prague, unpolitical, and I would say rather nice poems, by the way. And new Czech writers, well, for example, to tell more good things about my father, it's always nice to say good things because many people will say also bad things about him. But he knew Thomas Mann personally. Next to Klaipėda, approximately 50 kilometers from Klaipėda, there is a house where Thomas Mann used to spend his summers in the interwar period. And after the war, my father met Thomas Mann and invited him to his former house. Thomas Mann was non-committal, yes, well, because to go to the Soviet Union, that was a political act, and Thomas Mann was not necessarily ready for such an act. But he expressed some interest. When my father came back to Lithuania and went to that house, he found out that the house was totally neglected, in a very, very bad shape. And he took pains to restore the house, to organize its restoration. Now the house is a Thomas Mann Museum next to Klaipėda, and from that time on. So I was born and I was brought up in a family, yes, in a communist family. My father joined the Communist Party only in the year 1950, but he did it. Stalin was still alive at that time. And I was brought up as a member of the Komsomol, of the Communist Youth. That lasted until the year 1956. In 1956, I was 19 years old, and the Hungarian Revolution happened. Also Polish Revolution. There were big changes in Poland, and I already knew Polish language. I could buy a Polish newspaper or magazine in Vilnius, and those newspapers and magazines were much more interesting than Russian or Lithuanian newspapers or magazines. So, and when the Soviets destroyed the Hungarians, the Hungarian Revolution, when they destroyed the city of Budapest, I understood that something is very wrong with that system. And from that time on, well, that I usually say that this was a sort of a Buddhist enlightenment. You know that in Zen Buddhism there is, they give an example of enlightenment. Your teacher, your guru, beats you by a stick, gives you a blow on your head. And this is the enlightenment. You understand everything, yes, in a short part of a second. So when the Soviets entered Budapest, that was this stick on my head, and I understood almost everything. That was my enlightenment, and I became an oppositionist, which was rather an important choice for me, a political, ideological, and also literary choice. I became interested in modernist literature, for example, in Kafka, for example. Not only Kafka, speaking about the Prague writers, I liked and still like also Jaroslav Hašek, and I like very much Karel Čapek. Some Czech poets as well. Even the mentioned Nezval, I think he was not a bad poet. And so on and so on, and Seifert and others. So I started to propagate, to popularize that modernist literature in Lithuania, which was also not always easy. I made acquaintances with Russian oppositionist and modernist writers, such as Boris Pasternak and Anna Akhmatova. And
you got to know them personally, didn't you?
yes, I met both of them personally. Pasternak for half an hour. He mainly explained me that I was wrong translating his poetry into Lithuanian, that his poetry was good for nothing, that it was pretentious, that it was unintelligible and totally uninteresting, that the only good thing he wrote was his novel, Dr. Zhivago, which I read at that time and was not a big fan of Dr. Zhivago. I am still not a big fan of that novel, although it is an important novel, but I like Pasternak's poetry better. Then Akhmatova, that's a long story. If you are not tired, I can tell it about it. I translated some poetry of Akhmatova into Lithuanian, and I was invited to her to present my translations to her flat. She lived in poverty. She did not have her own flat. She lived in the flats of her friends, mainly, and I was invited to a flat of one of her friends. I was warned that, have in mind, there are lots of graphomaniacs who come to Akhmatova reading their poetry. She is fed up with that, absolutely. But she is a very nice lady. She always finds good words for everybody. For example, she may say, you are rhyming perfectly. Your rhyming is extremely good. That means your poetry is for nothing. Or you are a master of stanza. That means your poetry is for nothing. And then, if she liked a poem, she said, there is some mystery in that poem. That was the sign that she liked the poem. Solzhenitsyn, who was another Nobel Prize winner after Pasternak, also wrote not only prose, for which he is slightly famous, but also poetry. And he came to Akhmatova and read his poetry to her. His poetry was very bad. Then she said, well, it lacks mystery. Then Solzhenitsyn said, and in your poetry, Anna Andreevna, there is too much of mystery. It should be simpler. Then, when I read my translations to Akhmatova, Lithuanian translation, she said, yes, I know that Lithuanian is a very special language, it's an archaic, old Indo-European language, very interesting one. One of my husbands, she was married 4 times in her life. One of my second husband was of Lithuanian origin. So I have some idea of Lithuanian, some very, very approximate idea. So please read me your translations. I read. She said, yes, the intonation is okay. Then I understood that the translations are for nothing. I said, well, thank you, goodbye, and left her flat and wanted to commit suicide. But I was lucky, because Akhmatova had a friend a great scholar whose name was Ivanov, now deceased, but at that time he was young enough, he approximately 10 years older than myself. And Ivanov knew 50 languages, including Lithuanian. His Lithuanian was as good as mine. He came to Akhmatova, and Akhmatova did show him the translation, said, well, that was a Lithuanian guy who did show me his translations. What do you think about them? Ivanov read them and said, well, not too bad, not too bad. Then Akhmatova called me by phone and said, now I understand, there is some mystery in your translations. Please come and we can speak about everything. So I visited her many times and we were, well, it's difficult to tell we were friends because she was much older and much more important personality, but we were personally acquainted and in a sense even close. So that was my story with Akhmatova. Then, well, and such interest in modernism and interest in incorrect political ideas, it ended badly because I had to emigrate, but that's a different...
Let's come to that later, yes.
Yes, and
let's hear another poem. Shall we hear another poem?
Okay.
Third poem. This is Básně o paměti, a poem about memory.
It's much simpler. Tu lauki pasitraukusių, giliai jie pasitraukė, jos paliko sienos, pieštukai, laikrodžiai, paveikslai sielos, lietus ir sniegas, atpildas ir smėlis, nemirtingumas ir pušų spygliai. Nebežinia, kuris iš jų teisus, ir kai rašai išsiskyrimų sumą, nebetenki be tikslio vientisumo ir pats skiriesi priešingus balsus. Belieka ratas brėžiamas peiliu, žymės stikle ir dulkės ant lentynų, tiek netiesos, tiek laisvės ir eilių, ir taip nedaugel tikrojo likimo. Belieka du balsai, nepalitėjus šio miesto šiltą ir nejaukų tūlį. Jiems buvo duotas lašas atminties, tu ją turi ir niekas jos neturi, o blaškosi, sparnuota ir akla, tarsi kregždė, kurios negeidžia lizdas, ir ko bevertas tavo klasicizmas, linksma ir iškilminga mokykla. Taip valanda nuo mūsų atskirta ir pasmerkta nukrinta kaip skala ant kambarių, koridorių ir laiptų ir ant spragos, kuri vis tiek yra tarp būtojo ir būsimojo laiko.
Báseň o paměti. Čekáš na ty, co odešli? V hloubku praničí odešli? A navždycky si sebou vzali hodiny, obrazy, tužky, myš psali deště i sněhy, písek i čerstvé žaly, nesmrtelnost a borovicové jehličí. Kdo z o něch vzdálivších se měl pravdu, Pán Bůh ví. A teď, když vážíš sumu rozluk těch hostí, sám ztrácíš bezúčelnost své celistvosti a nechtě se štěpíš v protikladné promluvy. Zbývá kruh vyrytý nožem v náhlém popudu, znaménko na skle, starý prach na policích, tolik nepravd a svobody veršů znících a tak pomálu opravdového osudu. A zbývají dva hlasy. Budou se dotýkat neútulných objemů města jak stíny, nadány kapkou paměti, schopností se ptát, i ty máš onu schopnost a nikdo jiný. paměť, kapka, bloudí slepě kol dokola, jak vlašťovka odmítaná hnízdy života. A jakou cenu pak má tvůj klasicismus, ta veselá a důstojně noblesní škola, ta hodina od nás oddělená řádem svým a předurčená k zániku, i vždy příště se klade na stěny, chodby, na schodiště a na tu skulinu, jež přesto zeje mezi časem minulým a časem budoucím.
I also have the poem here in English translation. I don't want to overwhelm you with poetry in many languages, but maybe it's worth reading, especially for those who speak only English. It's in a translation by Jonas Zdanis, a poem about memory. You wait for those who have retreated. They withdrew deeply. They were abandoned by walls, pencils, clocks, paintings, souls, rain and snow, retribution and sand, immortality and the needles of the pines. We don't know which of them is right, and when you write down the sum of separations, you lose your aimless singleness and split apart into opposing voices. There remains a circle scratched by a knife, a mark on the glass and dust on the shelves. So much falsehood, so much freedom and so many lines, and so little of the unmistaken destiny. Two voices remain. They will touch the hot and unpleasant contents of this town. They were given a drop of memory. You have it, and no one has it. And it knocks about, winged and blind, like a swallow unwanted by its nest. And then, what is your classicism worth, your happy and noteworthy school? That's how an hour, torn from us and condemned, falls like a scarf on the rooms, corridors and stairs, and on the gap that still remains between time past and to come. That last line makes me think of T.S. Eliot and four quartets about time past and time present.
Maybe. Well, this is also has some reference to Akhmatova, because she developed a sort of cult of memory. On the gate of the palace she lived in, well, she lived not necessarily in the palace, she had a small flat, a small mansard in that palace, but on the gate there were and still are the words in Latin, Deus conservat omnia, God preserves everything. So, and she used to say that we human beings, we should imitate the Almighty, the Lord, and try also to preserve at least something. We cannot preserve everything, but we should preserve at least something. She preserved memory of her perished friends, she preserved memory of perished city, of a lost city, St. Petersburg, later Leningrad, and so on and so on. So this has some reference to that cult of memory. Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that, you think, specifically because of the trauma of 20th century history, of so much having been lost?
Oh yes, of course, definitely, especially in the totalitarian countries, in the Soviet Union or also in the Nazi Germany. Lots of memory has been lost, and the poets had a duty to preserve at least something. By the way, Akhmatova liked traditional forms of poetry, traditional meters, rhyming and so on, which is almost never used in today's Western poetry. or probably in today's Czech poetry, also in Lithuanian poetry, because she thought, and rightly so, that this strict form helps to preserve memory. It's easier to memorize a poem written in traditional form. She wrote a famous book about Stalin's crimes, about repressions in the Soviet Union. The title of the book is Requiem. To keep that manuscript in one's flat was mortally dangerous, so she did not keep it. She asked several of her friends to memorize all the poems. There were 14 of them, I believe. They were short enough. They memorized, and she destroyed the manuscript. And after many, many years, that was reconstructed from memory. So this cult of memory, of course, is especially important for people who came to the totalitarian experience. And well, everybody in our part of Europe came through that totalitarian experience.
I think it was your colleague and friend Czesław Miłosz who said that a poet can no longer allow himself the privilege of being a lyric poet, that it's not enough, that in the wake of experience of 20th century history, it's simply not enough to be a lyric poet.
Yes.
Do you share that view? I think, hearing your poetry, I think you do.
Yes, well, of course, it's not enough. For example, there was a friend of Miloš. Miloš was a poet of Vilnius. He graduated from the Vilnius University. He was very much connected to the Lithuanian capital. He knew some Lithuanian, at least some Lithuanian. And there was another poet in Vilnius, Konstantin Ildefons Galczynski, his contemporary, who was a strictly lyrical poet. Very witty, very good poet, by the way, and yes, in many senses. Although politically compromised. Galczynski was politically compromised. When Miloš emigrated, Galczynski wrote terrible poem about Miloš. But Galczynski was just a lyric, and Miloš had in mind also him, speaking about that it's not enough to be just a lyric poet. Although Galczynski still remembered and still liked by many, including myself. But it's not enough. A poet has to be a poet of memory, a poet of tradition, preserving the tradition, this thread of tradition which should not be cut, should never be cut. And also a poet of eschatology, thinking about how all that will end. Will end not necessarily in our world, but in the transcendental world. That there should be some, how to say it, some justification of everything that happened, which goes on the theological plane.
I'm talking about Miłoš or T.S. Eliot earlier. I mean, you fit very much into the tradition of Christian verse as well, don't you? Christian poetry. I
am a very bad Christian, although I am. I believe in Lord, but I don't practice, virtually don't go to the church. Miloš, in his last years, he attended church. I did not. Brodsky used to say, when people asked him, do you believe in God? He answered, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And many people could say the same words. like Brodsky. I also can say it. But still that part of universe, that part of life is important for me. It is important for me, and Brodsky has written several strictly religious poems, and some of them are very good. For example, Nunc Dimittis, probably the best Christian poem written in the 20th century. I also have several strictly religious poems, which are not among this group of poems we are reading today.
We're going to hear another poem now, which is called Hluboké noci, Deep in the Night. And there's a lot about language in this poem, I think, and I hope that, as we said earlier, we're going to return to the subject of
yes, okay, but maybe we will not read it in Lithuanian, just in Czech.
Okay.
For
the sake of keeping things going.
Yes, okay.
Okay. Let's hear that then. Hluboké noci, just in Czech. Just a second.
V hluboké noci se obrovský foliant přede mnou rozkřídlil. Černý a plameny popsaný exodus a možná pouze slovník, šifry a hieroglyfy s číslicemi. Smysl, jež sebe smil. To, co si netroufnou zašeptat krystaly, vlaštovka ani trávník. Ke straně skloněná sláva hvězd vesmírem proplouvá bez cíle. Duše a století splývají, století setřené z valné části. Čas vězní duše a prázdnota svádí z cesty těla v přesile. Nerozlišíš, co je fotografie a co labyrint či pasti. Fosfor a zlato a magnezit, toskánské náboje oblohy. Svou plnost pozbývá slovo a od zvuku měkký stín odklání se. Zemřela latina. Není, kdo zpěvný disk chopil by za rohy. Syntax se drobí a rozpadá. Černozem, hlína a ostrý písek. Jen citoslovce a intonace možná vyvedou z chaosu. Málo jsme ochutnali medu, však věcí pravých přece jen jsme syti. Zahrada, pramen a oblásky. Oblaka troucí se o rosu. Nic překvapivějšího nad život a nic skutečnějšího smrti. Nikdy se neptej proč. Jen ten, kdo otevřel naráz dveře a vnik do končin bez kopců, bez hvězd a bez záruk nebeské spásné záře, odstrkuje štítem čas, jak povalený etruský kopytník. A nabraným smyslem svažuje si už neexistující tváře.
Yes. So yes, it's a poem about language to a large degree. It's a poem about language. It's a poem about Toscana, about part of Italy, which I love, which is a bit similar to Lithuania from the point of view of the landscape and also from the point of view of architecture, because Vilnius is as Italian city as, let us say, Vicenza or Padova or Bergamo. It was built mainly by Italians, by Italian architects. Only one of them was Czech, Benedict Wright. Now,
in fact, I think he was Swabian.
Yes, and Toscana brings to mind just several strata of language. First of all, it is the land of Dante. and I speak about that, about those singing discs, then it has much in common with Latin, and before Latin there was Etruscan language. So those different layers of languages which, like palimpsest, they go on top of each other. And the language is just also a way of preserving an era, way of preserving society, way of preserving a human experience, the best way we have, the very best way we have. So it's a poem about that. It has references to Mandelstam. I never met Mandelstam. He perished during the Stalin period. He was, murdered in one of Stalin prison camps. But I knew his widow. And Nadezhda Mandelstam, who was a writer in her own right, she wrote a very, very significant book of memoirs. So, and Mandelstam also was speaking about that Tuscan memory of things about about the land of Dante, the land of Virgil, the land of Etruscs, Etrusc people, and so on and so on. So, although there are no mention of Mandelstam or any direct quotation for him, the poem tries to preserve some memory also of him.
And if I could also ask you specifically about the Lithuanian language, Lithuanian
language is a strange language. Yesterday I found in internet a comment of a Pole who tried to learn Lithuanian and who wrote an internet comment, a terrible language. So my wife, who is present in this hall and who tries to learn Lithuanian, also said more than once, it is a terrible language. It's very, very complicated. It's Indo-European, that means it is connected to Slavic languages, including Czech, or Russian for that matter. It is connected to German, it is connected to Latin. For example, vir, that means man in Latin, in Lithuanian it is vyras. In Celtic it is fyr. Then fire. In Latin it is ignis. In Lithuanian it is ugnis. So very similar. When I read Latin poets, virtually in every line I find Lithuanian roots. They say that there are 6 classical Indo-European languages: Latin, Ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Gothic, which is the oldest non-existing today German language, Church Slavic, which also does not exist anymore except in church, usage, and Lithuanian. The 6th one is Lithuanian. The Lithuanian is only one which is alive and kicking. Some witty person said it's more kicking than alive, but it's just a witticism. It is pretty much alive. 3 million of people speak it, but it is archaic, very close to the Indo-European proto-language from which all the Slavic, German, Romance languages descended. Lithuanian is the closest one. And for that reason it is incredibly complicated. There is so-called priegaidė in Lithuanian, which means musical stress, which is not necessarily stress in any other Indo-European language. Well, something similar it is in Serbian, I believe. I mentioned this priegede in this Tuscan poem. To learn Lithuanian, one really has to pay much effort to that.
And to write poetry in Lithuanian.
Yes, and well, when you know it from your early childhood, it's very natural to write poetry in Lithuanian, very natural. Although they must check, for example, the stresses. One never knows should be the stress in Lithuanian on the first syllable, on the second, on the third. It's difficult to tell. One should check it in a dictionary.
And what about the tradition of poetry in Lithuania?
About tradition?
About tradition, the tradition that you're building?
Well, the Lithuanian poetry started in the 16th century. That was the translations of the religious songs, of the religious hymns, of psalms and so on. Partly of the poetry written by Martin Luther. That was translated into Lithuanian. Then we had a really great poet, Donelaitis, in the 18th century. And then we had lots of poets in the 19th and the 20th century. In the 20th century, there are already poets who are as good as any German or Russian or Czech or Polish poet. Like, for example, Henrikas Radauskas, who was an emigre. He died in the United States in the year 1960. I met him once in my life. I was 5 years old. But Henrikas Radauskas was almost as good poet as Mandelstam or, let us say, Georgy Ivanov or Akhmatov, for that matter, on the same level.
I think it's time to hear another poem. This is a poem, another longer poem. It's called the poem about friends. The reason why we chose this poem was because it's dedicated to Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who is well known in this country, or in Czechoslovakia, because she was arrested after protesting on Red Square against the 1968 occupation. And she was also a good friend of yours.
Yes. I knew Natalia Gorbanevskaya rather well. We were close friends during my times in Moscow. I spent 4 years of my life in Moscow. And I made friends with Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who was not yet famous at that time. Not yet famous. And I met her later many times in Vilnius and also in Paris. She emigrated and she died in Paris. So she is a national hero of the Czech people, because she demonstrated with 6 of her friends on the Red Square when the Soviets invaded Prague. Later she was imprisoned and so on, but was lucky enough, she was finally released and allowed to emigrate. She emigrated to Paris and died in Paris, not very long ago. I think she was a friend of Václav Havel, and she was an honorary citizen of Czech Republic. So when she and her friends demonstrated in Moscow, I wrote a poem. About that. It is also not immediately intelligible. In Russia, they would probably understand it. In Lithuania, the censors did not understand it, and it was printed. It was printed even with a dedication to N.G., to Natalia Gorbanevskaya. At present, I printed with the full name, Natalia Gorbanevskaya. This is about those people who dared to protest against the Soviet invasion in Moscow. At that time I was in Vilnius. I am not so sure that we should read it in Lithuanian. Maybe also read it also in Czech, because we don't have too much time.
Well, could you, given that we've been talking about the Lithuanian language, could you read maybe the first verse?
Okay.
And then we'll go over to Czech.
Or maybe I will read the last stanza.
Okay, so we'll start with Kajetán.
Báseň o přátelích Natálie Gorbaněvské. Třeba, že cizí nejsou vlastně cizí a všechno, co se nestačilo stát, proudem nebytí zacíleně mizí, jako by v něm snad směr šlo rozeznat. Zvláště, když za městem už kvapem šírá, přijímač hraje, sprchne v zápětí a nikdo na petlici nezavírá, poslední okamžiky podletí. Do dveří vstoupí, až se začne tmít, odešlý, opozdilý, odrodilý, pro které je náš neprostorný byt jediné Elysium v této chvíli. Jejich stín spánkem jiných bloudit směl, kdo zapomněli na vzájemné zrady, osidlují se na dně zrcadel a nečekaně vyplouvají k hládi. Tak vstanou z rakví bez grimasy muky, křídlaté ženy, bratři neznámí, generace už proměněné v zvuky, ve stránky knih a v drny s travami. A živé vybírá si zarputile buď mlha, domov, dálava či schon. Jejich zbraní je mečení a píle. A možnou spásou snad jen Apolón. Z hranicí světa v jedno splyne střecha a noc oddělí oblevu a mráz. Před tváří smrti, která vždycky spěchá, řeč zachová jim věrnost celý čas, leptajíc jejich myšlenky i kosti, jamami pod schodištěm jistíc dům. Než dojdou k nežádané budoucnosti, jak znovu nalezeným předmětům. Navštěvovali náš les. Jejich prsty, jak strom, si pamatuje nábytek. Vstupem do pevných roků, do zrálosti se třásly z beder světský stud i vztek. Tvoří rodinu velikou a prostou, v níž děti mají jednu sudbu. Tu pokraje hlasy zaplňovat prostor a bez přestání plašit prázdnotu. Nevěřím na neštěstí. Věřím za to přátelům, s nimiž o úměrný díl přímky svět, oči, obláto i zlato, ubohé cesty jsem se podělil. V kaskádách světa tonou tváře temné, lucerny hasnou, pravda vyvstává, echa kroků však střetají se ve mně, jak rovnoběžky, kde si vdálavá. A znovu je tu podzim s dary všemi. Ve městě houfcem duší spaseném, nad domy cizími i tramvajemi začíná září právě dnešním dnem. Hlíný proud řeky, remorké rypění a nervy drásá sebe slabší hvist. Jak zlatý rytířský erb na brnění lpí na vozovce první spadlý list.
Ir vėl ruduo pritrenkęs dosnumu, mieste, kurį laimėjo kelios sielos, virš svetimų tramvajų ir namų. Šią valandą prasideda rugsėjis, didžiulės baržos dunkso vandenį, iš ryto įtemptas kiekvienas nervas ir pats pirmasis lapas grindinį, kampuotas tarsi literiškas herbas. Okay, now, well, I think we can skip the next poem because it's long and we'll end with a short poem.
Yeah, maybe also, I mean, there's one question I have to ask you.
What?
There's one question I have to ask you.
Yes,
first,
please.
Which is what you're doing here in Prague, because it's extremely interesting.
What?
What you're working on here in Prague.
On what I'm working
During
here
your
in
stay,
Prague.
because you were talking about
Okay.
a book that you're
I wrote 2 poems here. In 2 months, well, I am not a prolific poet. I write poetry very rarely. I translate. My translations are more numerous than my original poems. But I wrote approximately 250 poems in my life. So 249th and 250th were written here in Prague. One of them about the Ukrainian war, and the second one about an imagined meeting which never happened. You know that Marina Tsvetaeva, a great Russian poet, lived in Prague in 1922-23. And at the same time, Franz Kafka lived in Prague, 1922, 1923, in 24 he died. They never met, and they probably did not know about each other. Later, Tsvetaeva read Kafka's works, but that was much later. I just imagined the situation that Tsvetaeva sits in a cafe, and Kafka enters the cafe, sits at the next table. They never see each other. They don't think about each other. She looks at the window. He thinks about his own problems. She drinks coffee, he drinks wine, and so on. That lasts 10 minutes. Then Kafka stands up, pays, and leaves. They never met. I end the poem with the words, well, I would like them to meet, although that could not change anything. That could not change. Both, the fate of both, as everybody knows, was very, very tragic. And if they met, the fate of both would still be as tragic as it was. So there are 2 poems, one of them rhymed, and the poem about Tsvetaeva and Kafka is in vers libre. Very simple, by the way, very straightforward. And I also wrote a piece of memoirs about an Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, a Nobel Prize winner whom I met several times in life, so I could tell something about him. Lithuanian magazine asked me to write those memoirs. So that was my work in Prague.
Incidentally, Seamus Heaney came several times to Prague, and he loved it here. And
oh yes,
he wrote a translation of Jan Arček's Zápisník zmizelého. What is it in English? Diary of a Disappeared Person, which is a wonderful translation.
Yeah, have you met him?
I just saw him in the audience as...
I see.
No, I didn't actually meet him.
Yes, was he in this building?
He probably was at some stage in this building, but his reading was in the Irish Embassy, I seem to remember, the one that I saw. It might have been in the Docks Literary Centre.
I see.
So which is the poem that you're going to read at the end?
The very last one.
Spatialisme, that's the...
Well, it is a love poem. Very short. Mes pasimatėm pro kitų žodžius, nelyginant pro perregimą sieną, o tam, kas mudu kvietė į svečius, gyventi liko nedaugiau kaip mėnuo. Tarsi rodyklis sukasi dvasia, išvarginta nežemiško garsyno, ir kartos pasikeičia mumyse,
kaip kitados įsakėm nemozinį. Į savo gūžtą traukiasi žiema, nebeįstengus mūsų išganyti, tarp miestų, tarp Nadyro ir Zenito, tarytum sodas ošia tyluma.
Spatřili jsme se skrze slova jiných, neostře jako přes průhlednou zeď. A tomu, kdo zval na návštěvu v síni, zbýval už sotva měsíc pro závěť. Jak rafička se duše s duší mine, nad pozemskými zvuky znavená, tak pokolení střídají se v nás v souladu se zákony nemosyné. Zima se schoulila v brdlohu svém, už nemá sil přijít s vybítkou lichou. Mezi dvěma městy, tím Nadyrem a Zenitem, jako sad šumí ticho.
Thank you. Okay, we spent around
an hour and a half.
and a half.
Yes, I think though I want to leave space for some questions as well.
Yes.
And there's so many things. You've had such an interesting life so far. There are so many things we haven't talked about. You're co-founder of the Lithuanian Helsinki group. We haven't talked at all about your emigration and the reasons for that, the complex reasons for that. And we haven't talked about your life as an academic at two of the world's top universities. Another time. But let's have some questions. If you could maybe speak into the microphone, that would be great.
Hello. I've been to Lithuania only once, and I wonder if you are also fond of Lithuanian countryside, because you've talked about Lithuanian cities, and another part of Lithuania is it's a beautiful countryside.
Countryside.
Yes.
Yes. You know, Lithuanians, until the very recent times, Lithuanians were mainly peasants. I think it's also comparable to the Czech lands. Czechs were mainly peasants, and the city people were mainly German speakers. In Lithuania, the city people were either Polish speakers or German speakers or Yiddish speakers. And in the countryside, the population was ethnic Lithuanian, speaking this ancient and strange and terrible Lithuanian language. So now the cities also speak Lithuanian, but only that this is a recent phenomenon. Most of the Lithuanian poetry is related to the countryside. It is a poetry written by peasants, including also my father, but not only him. Well, our most famous poet of all, Donelaitis, an 18th century poet, whom I mentioned already, he wrote about the peasants. He wrote a poem similar to Virgil's Georgica, about peasant labor, about change of seasons. Every season has its own calendar, its own labors, and so on and so on. So, underground, by subway, by metro, that was possible. I had no possibility to enter East Germany because I was thrown out of the Soviet Union. I was an emigre without any necessary documents and so on. And it was even dangerous to go to the eastern part of Europe, for example, to Prague.
But I crossed the East Berlin in the underground, and I wrote a poem about that experience. The second poem was about the end of the Berlin Wall. One of my friends, a female friend, she is much younger than myself, she was one of the very last persons who crossed the Berlin Wall with all the necessary documents. She arrived to the Zoo station in Berlin, and something happened. She found out that there were lots of people dancing, crying, weeping, laughing, singing. That was the night when the Berlin Wall fell. She never understood it. She did not speak German, she did not speak English, she did not understand it. She thought, well, it's Western Europe. Probably they sing and dance every night. She did not understand that she is in a new universe. So this is a poem about that experience. And the third poem is about a new Berlin without a Berlin Wall. But if you want, yes, I also wrote some poems about Lithuanian countryside. For example, there was a moment when I was given a possibility to live in Sejny. Sejny is a Polish town where Czesław Miłosz also lived, and it is next to the Lithuanian border, 8 kilometers from the border of Lithuania. So with my wife we spent more than a month in Sejny, and I wrote several poems about the local landscape, about the countryside landscape. Well, one could say it is Polish landscape, but in reality it's Lithuanian, because people there are mainly ethnic Lithuanians, although it belongs to Poland. Mm-hmm.
That was quite some answer. Any other comments or questions?
Another question.
Follow-up question.
Thank you for your answer. One of your predecessors as a poet in Lithuania, the only one I have ever read, who actually had similar interests about human destiny, about history, and about future, was Mierzolaitis. Have you known him? And do you?
Well, I knew Mierzolaitis personally. He was much older than myself. My father knew him very well, but my father was older than Mierzolaitis. But Mierzolaitis was a Soviet poet, a Sovietized poet, and he is not too much liked in today's Lithuania because he was, full of that communist ideology. At that time he was considered an innovator because he wrote a bit like Walt Whitman, a bit verse about human being, human destiny, human history in a very abstract terms. Similar to Whitman's song to myself, I would say, imitating Whitman. At that time it was something innovative in Lithuanian poetry. He was very popular, he was very famous, he was not a very good man, by the way, but, not without some gifts, poetic gifts, but he died more than 20 years ago, and he is not much remembered in today's Lithuania.
Not without gifts is almost as damning with separate phrases. Akhmatova saying it rhymes well. Anyone else got any
last
comments?
question, if I
Yes, please.
You mentioned what I found very interesting, your meeting with Anna Akhmatova and your acquaintance with her. And I read about her in the memories of Kornei Chukovsky.
Yes.
The author of the theorist of children literature, who wrote from 2 to 5 about children literature. He remembered Anna Akhmatova. His impression of her was that she gave an extremely singular impression of an aristocratic person, Did she impress you so as well?
Yes, well, she definitely looked an aristocratic person. She was of noble origin, by the way, of nobility, small nobility, but still, yes, still nobility. And well, she looked and she behaved like Catherine the Great or Maria Theresa. She was a sort of a queen. And everybody was very timid looking at her. So Tchaikovsky was correct in writing about Akhmatova. By the way, but coming back to Lithuanian poetry, to Mieželaitis, a poet whom I would recommend, I don't know, was he translated into Czech or well, but he was translated into Russian, for example, I think also into English, into German, Martinaitis. Martinaitis was a very good poet. He was my, not only contemporary, but of my age. He died several years ago. He was my friend. And he wrote a poem about Kukutis. Kukutis is an imagined person who can be compared to Švejk in Czech literature. Lithuanian peasant of a very specific character, a comic character that is well comic and tragicomic, but the poems about Kukutis are really very good. I very strongly recommend them.
Thank you very much.
So, quickly wind things up, I think. If there's no more comments or questions, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Above all, thank you so much, Tomas Venclova, for being here. You've actually, you're an amazing advertisement for Lithuania. On the subject of the countryside, comparing it to the Tuscan countryside, I think that's a pretty good bit of advertising, and it's made me really want to go there. And it's been a great pleasure hearing you read your poems, talk about your life and work. There's so much more that we could hear from you. In fact, on the internet there's on YouTube there is a monologue where you're talking for a couple of hours about your life in Lithuanian with subtitles in English, which I was completely absorbed by, which you'll easily find on YouTube. Thank you, and thank you as well to Kajetán for reading the poems in Czech. And thank you for coming.